Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Whenever you happen to see this podcast and have a desire to watch it, whatever message it might have for you. My name is Sister Myra Lambert. I live in Batavia, Illinois. I am a servant of the Holy Heart of Mary. I have lived a vowed life for 62 and a half years. Even as I say that, it doesn't seem possible, though. I have had several ministries in these 62 and a half years. I began ministry as a teacher. Really, I continued as a teacher because I was a lay teacher in one of our schools before I entered the community. I taught for almost 10 years in 8th grade and in high school. I went into parish ministry in 1969 and later into vocation ministry. And then finally, about 15 years ago, I was able to begin my present ministry, which is full-time spiritual direction. The spiritual direction, as I see it in my ministry, takes many forms. Some of it is one-on-one spiritual direction, but I'm a part of many groups. And in all of those groups, I think there's spiritual formation that's going on. The topic of Catholic Sisters Week, celebrating tradition, changing the world, reminds me so much of the tenets of the Israelite community in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Testament. The most important belief that they had was that they were to care for the most vulnerable in their midst, the elderly, the widows, the orphans, those that were limited in some way. Our fundamental code asks us always in our ministry and in our service to look to the needs of those who we call the preferential poor. Several years ago, our general chapter asked us in a special way to meet the needs of women and children who were in need. So all around us we have that call to be aware of serving those who are in need and who are really the most vulnerable. I do believe that celebrating tradition and changing the world through my ministry of spiritual direction happens. In many ways, spiritual directors are hard to find. It's a ministry that calls for one person to be the director and another to be the directee. It's humbling to do the work of the director, of trying to listen to the voice of the Spirit working within another person. It's a privilege, and yet it's at the same time humbling, because all of us are always on our way. None of us have ever arrived. So how did I get into spiritual ministry? In the early 70s, I was in parish ministry in the Archdiocese of Chicago, specifically at Fort City Catholic Center. It was an experimental ministry in a non-territorial parish, and also an experiment with leadership being done together by priests and sisters. It was an opportunity for growth that was amazing. I went from that experience to a parish in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, where our sisters were also serving there, but in the school. And again, that experience was very stretching. All of that led me in the mid-70s to seek out a spiritual director. And at that time, the Sisters of the Cenacle had a retreat house and spiritual ministry in Wayzata, Minnesota, which was near us. And so I went there and began seeing a sister from the Cenacle and made my first 8-day directed retreat with her. After that retreat, I was back in my own ministry in the parish, and was working with different groups of women. And oftentimes they would ask me about prayer, about spiritual life. And I would always refer them to one of the sisters at the Cenacle and suggest that they start spiritual direction. Finally, my spiritual director suggested that maybe I should just work with the women as they approach me, that maybe that was the way in which the Holy Spirit was calling me to this ministry. So I began doing that, and I soon realized that I needed and wanted to be trained in some way in spiritual direction. I found a program at the University of San Francisco, and it was a wonderful program, more on the academic side than on the side of skills. But I supplemented the skill part by taking CPE right in Minnesota. In the 90s, when I was actually in vocation ministry, I started a program at Villa Maria Retreat Center in Pennsylvania, and they had an adult learning model where we would go on campus for 2 weeks for in-person education, and then the rest of the time for 4 years we did work in our own locales, and that work included doing spiritual direction, writing up a verbatim of each of our sessions, seeing a supervisor one-on-one, doing a lot of reading and a lot of writing of reports. But it was just one of the very best programs I think I've ever been on, and they're still in existence. The spiritual direction has a long history in the church. You know, we could even say that Jesus did spiritual direction. The scene that comes to my mind right away is Jesus and the woman at the well. You know, that Jesus is doing spiritual direction as he leads the woman at the well from one place where she's at to another to another. The letters of St. Paul are, in a sense, spiritual direction given through letters. Then, you know, we have the monks, the Benedictine monks that began all the monasteries that were set up, that were places of learning, but they were places of spiritual care also. So the whole sense of spiritual direction as a history has continued long into our history. Some high points were changes that happened. I think specifically of St. Francis de Sales, who was one of the first who urged laymen and women to go into spiritual direction. Before that, it had been primarily priests, sisters, brothers. But St. Francis de Sales was just the saint who really encouraged lay people to go into this. The 80s were just an outstanding time of growth in spiritual direction. Not only were people seeing the need and the value of it for themselves, but then schools of training programs started for spiritual directors. And the result has just been a lot more laymen and women are in the ministry of spiritual direction now, but that everyone sees it as valuable in our relationship with God, in that growth and understanding of our own spiritual life and our needs. Really, one of the results of the pandemic was that people realized that we could do spiritual direction on Zoom. And that's been a new and creative possibility also. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. You know, pray about whether God is calling you to begin spiritual direction in your own spiritual life. You know, get in touch with your parish or the diocese. Contact someone who might be able to answer your questions. or email me if you'd like to. And we can talk about spiritual direction and what your needs and desires are and how those could be met. So thank you again for watching. God bless.